John, happy Monday.
Hey, Kerry. Good to talk to you again.
As always. So, hey, got some questions before we get into the show. This is from Jesse. Okay, Kerry, I dang near fell out of the saddle when I heard Charles Nenner state that the Dow Jones Industrials is going to 2,500. Now, this seems to be in conflict with his 2,500 gold call. He's a big proponent of cycles. I'm a big proponent of critical thinking. So without getting into the rest of the question, I think this is a good one here, and I think it plays more into the rising interest rates. But Dow 2,500, I mean, that's an existential threat to the global economic system as we know it, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's a Great Depression kind of move. 90% drop in the biggest stock index. And, there's so many moving parts out there that affect where financial asset prices go that it's really hard to, tease out one scenario from it all. But a scenario in which stocks could drop hard would be one in which we have a bond market crisis where interest rates go way up and you're comparing stock returns to the return you can get on a bond. Generally, when you decide where you put money, if you're a institutional investor, especially, and if interest rates spike, that makes stocks worth less relatively, and so you can see the stock market go down hard as money pours into treasury bonds yielding 9 or 10%, which is not historically impossible. Treasury bonds got up to I think 16% yields in 1980. When, by the way, I was working on a money market trading desk at a German bank. So I saw that happen firsthand and remember buying money and paying 16 or 18 or 20% interest on it at the time. So something like that is completely possible because there's historical precedent for it and because we screwed up our finances so completely now. That would be problematic for stocks, right? If you can get 16% on a treasury bond, then you've got to have a hell of a stock right there to buy that instead of the bond. So that's a scenario in which stocks could tank. But at the same time, we've got central banks that have been trained very differently this time around. When something that's systemically important starts moving, central banks just go in and buy it if they need to support it. So if stocks really tank this time around, you would see, first of all, central banks all over the world just creating a bunch of new currency and buying stocks. Janet Yellen is even on record as saying she wished she had the ability to buy assets that are more directly related to consumer behavior. She was talking about stocks. She wanted to be able to buy stocks. So they'll do it next time. And they have unlimited money. So it's unreasonable to expect stocks to drop by 90% when central banks have literally unlimited amounts of money to throw at the stock market if they need to. So again, there are so many moving parts, it's very hard to predict how asset prices progress from here. We've got a gigantic crisis out there, without doubt, because we've borrowed way too much money. That always and everywhere leads to a crisis. But the shape of the crisis is harder to predict. I would say that if central banks decide to intervene in asset markets in the next crisis by creating a huge amount of new currency and tossing it out there, you would see a lot of that currency flow into the only thing that's kind of guaranteed to go up when there's a big crisis and when there's huge money creation, and that's gold and silver. So if stocks tank and central banks intervene to stop stocks from tanking, a lot of that money would eventually flow into gold and silver. In other words, if the government intervenes to stop your Google stock from falling, then your impulse might be to go ahead and sell your Google stock to the government, take that cash and buy something that might benefit more directly from massive currency creation. So, as our talks usually end up, Kerry, all roads lead to gold and silver when financial asset prices become unpredictable because we've created too much debt in the world. And stocks could tank. bonds could tank, stocks could go up if huge amounts of terrified money flow in from overseas and central banks start buying stocks. But what will happen during that process is the gold and silver will do okay. They'll protect your purchasing power and probably go up in that kind of a crisis environment. So I would say that that's the place to hang out, because that's the one fairly stable, predictable variable in all of this.
And I agree with you. I mean, if they lose control, which is what we're talking about, the ramifications could be unfathomable.
Well, Kerry, they'll definitely lose control, but it's a question of what they lose control of. In other words, what did they sacrifice in order to protect the other stuff? And central banks buying trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of financial assets would probably mean that they're sacrificing the value of their currency in order to protect stock prices and bond prices. If they do that, then obviously you want to be in some other form of money, and that's where gold and silver come in.
Correct. Hey, agreed there. No question about it. So, we've got another question that's a little bit related to it. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but his questions are, how likely do you think interest rates could spike before PMs jump precious metals? Number two, or do you think a sudden reset of everything over a weekend is more likely? And this is from Randy, and a new subscriber message here. Just trying to hold off switching to a fixed rate as long as I dare, as far as his mortgage is concerned. Obviously, Randy, we can't give personal financial advice, but we can talk about markets. All of this has happened at one time or another. So interest rates probably going to spike to make, because that's when inflation will kick in, when the banks start lending again. And that could be when precious metals really start their ascendancy. What do you think about the prospect of a sudden reset on a weekend? I wouldn't have thought it's possible, but with our current occupant of the White House, who likes to keep people guessing and never likes to let the public or the press know what he's going to do, is that impossible, John?
Well, if you look at history, when countries screw up their finances, the value of their currency starts to go down, and then they tend to spring a monetary reset. In other words, a big devaluation of their currency, or a swap of their currency for a new, better currency on a weekend when the markets are closed. Because if you telegraph it ahead of time, then everybody just front runs you. And you in the government don't benefit from the action that you're taking. But what you want is to be able to issue new money on favorable terms that allow you to go forward with a sound currency. And you can't telegraph that ahead of time, because then everybody just buys whatever it is, and they dump the old currency and the currency value collapses while you still have it if you're the government. So when the monetary reset comes, and it will come, we have no choice, but at some point to take these current fiat currencies that are being so aggressively mismanaged by the governments and replace them with something better, probably gold-backed, it's got to be sprung on the market by surprise, because if it's not a surprise, everybody dumps dollars and euros and yen ahead of time, and you get monetary chaos. So yeah, I think that there's a very good chance at some point in the not super distant future that we have a monetary reset that just comes out of the blue for people who aren't paying attention. For people who have the sense of this financial history and how it's gone in the past, it won't be a surprise, because that's how it's always gone previously. But for people who have never lived through it and have never read any financial history that tells them otherwise, it'll be a big surprise. That one day they'll wake up on a Sunday and the dollar will henceforth be just a name for a certain weight of gold, say 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold. Mm-hmm. And it'll be exchangeable for gold, which means that the dollars that you had in your bank account are suddenly worth only 20% of what they were on Saturday. And it means milk is now $10 a gallon. Bread is $10 a loaf. A car is $250,000, where it used to be 35 or 40,000, because your currency became much less valuable. So you were the one who's hurt by that. You who trusted the government and kept your wealth in the government's currency. The people who make out from that are the ones who don't trust the government and who buy things that governments can't inflate away. If you own farmland, or if you own gold and silver, or if you own oil wells, those things are going to go up in value commensurate with the devaluation of the dollar. Mm-hmm. So the people who own real assets in general will be helped, or at least not hurt, by the monetary reset. The people who trusted the government and own financial assets, government bonds that pay you dollars, bank accounts in dollars, are the ones who are going to be hurt.
Right. Well, that makes complete sense. And we have seen, what you say is absolutely true, John. We've seen governments do this stuff before, haven't we? We've seen them pull this, literally pull the rug out from everybody, just like, boom, all at once, right? Happens. Yeah, happens actually. All the time.
I quoted a historical fiction book about Queen Elizabeth a while ago in an article about this, and got a lot of responses from people who like historical fiction. But there's a scene in it where the British pound, this is the 1500s, give or take, and the British pound is being inflated away, and nobody wants to hold pounds anymore. And so Queen Elizabeth over the weekend plans to do a reset where she calls in all the old coins and then issues new coins at unfavorable rates for the old coins.
Naturally.
But her boyfriend wasn't told about it. And he's enraged because he's going to lose big. So he confronts her, and they have this big scene where she says, but I had to do it, and he says, but you should have told me. And she says, but if I told you, everybody would find out and then it wouldn't work. So that's exactly what today's governments are going through, the same process. If the word gets out ahead of time that that's what they're doing, then they lose. But if they can keep it a secret, they win.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And that's what's going to happen here, you think, huh? I mean,
well, it has to at some point somehow, because the fiat currencies of the world don't work anymore. And the only solution to all the debt that isn't a 1930-style depression is to reset the currency. Massive devaluation. And the only way you can do that is by surprise. So we'll see. But something like that is out there somewhere, and that's what we should be preparing for. Because that's one of the only things that's actually predictable. All this other stuff, where is Google going to be in 5 years? That's really hard to call. But where is gold and silver going to be relative to today's fiat currencies? Much easier. That's a fairly simple intellectual problem.
I think you're right. I think you have a great point. So rising interest rates seems that that's going to be the trigger, isn't it?
Well, okay. There's a thing that James Turk and I termed in the book we wrote together a while ago called The Money Bubble, the variable rate world. And what that refers to is how everybody in the world has taken on variable rate debt that fluctuates with overall interest rates, or borrowed short term and has to roll over that debt. That's what a lot of governments have done, which also means it's variable rate, because you roll it over at whatever price prevails in the market. And if interest rates go up, you have to pay more. Well, that's happening to governments around the world right now. As interest rates go up, they're rolling over their short term debt at higher and higher rates, and they're having to borrow new money because they're running deficits, and that's at a higher rate. And so you're seeing the interest costs of governments explode. And the U.S., if we just went back to historically normal interest rates, 5%. In other words, an average of about 6% borrowing cost for the U.S. government, the interest bill would be like $1.3 trillion every year. That's on top of the deficit that we're already running. So we would be running deficits of $2 to $3 trillion at that point every year. And that would blow up the dollar, right? Or at least it should. So that's what governments are looking at.
That's
now.
A great point. So Ryan, and this fits in with something that FSN member Ryan brings up, isn't it interesting that the eve of Trump's meeting with Putin literally disposed of most, if not all, of Russia's treasury holdings? What to make of it?
Well, that's the weapon that our frenemies have out there. They own a lot of treasuries because they've been running trade surpluses with us. Russia has been selling oil into the global market and collecting dollars all along. They've been buying a lot of gold with those dollars, but they've also bought a lot of treasury bonds. Well, they're dumping those treasury bonds into a pretty strong market. You know, treasuries are still favorably priced, so he's getting a good deal. And he's the first one to do it. There's always been the question of
what if?
How would they get out of, how would China and Russia and Saudi Arabia and the other big holders of U.S. treasuries get out when the time comes? Because they're all looking at that scenario. Sometime in the future, they need to dump their treasuries before the dollar collapses. But Russia decided to do it first, which is the most favorable time to do something like that. Right now, China is stuck with a lot of treasuries. So is Japan, so is Saudi Arabia. And you can make the case that that's really the only financial asset game in town. If you want risk-free assets, you need to own treasuries. So in the short run, it's working for them to hold their treasuries. But in the long run, at some point, either because we're contending with them in some way, there's a trade war going on or something like that, and they need a weapon, or just because they don't trust the dollar anymore, they got to dump these treasuries. Russia did it first. Not a bad move, I think. But I think in general, the idea of the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency grates on these guys because it gives us a huge amount of power. Everybody wants dollars. So we can run huge trade surpluses and budget deficits, and everybody will take the dollars we're putting out there and give us real stuff in return. A lot of that real stuff we're buying is military hardware. So it allows us to dominate the world militarily and impose our will on, China's backyard and Russia's backyard. They don't like that. These are world powers who want to control their own destiny around their borders. And so the idea that the dollar will get weaker over time and lose its reserve currency status is not unattractive to these guys. They like that from a geopolitical standpoint, but it means all these dollars that they own are going to get less valuable. And so what do they do about that? So they've got kind of a conflicting set of goals, and the actions that they take will be in light of those conflicting set of goals. They've got a trade-off with anything that they do. And Russia chose to dump the best reserve asset right now because it has other goals. And those other goals are probably geopolitical at this point. They're trying to make a point that they can do that if they want to. They can basically just eliminate their dollar exposure. And then what are you going to do, Trump? That might be the point they're making geopolitically. And we'll see how it plays out. Hard to know how any of this plays out, given the personalities that are at work out there. There's a lot of unpredictable guys making big decisions these days.
Hey, and one more thing, trade war. So I've always contended there's no trade war. It's not really happening. It's a fiction of the media. And what the heck happened? But Juncker, Jean-Claude Juncker, is that his name? Or is it Jean-Claude Van Damme? I don't know. I get them confused. But he comes to the U.S. to see Trump. Trump doesn't go there. He's the president of the EU, and he comes to say, "Hey, what's a little tariff among friends? We'll cut it. We'll do what you want, and we'll work towards eliminating tariffs." And what's going to happen. Mexico is next, and you will see China have to come up with some kind of deal. Because if they're not going to take our garbage, our physical garbage, then they're going to have to take Trump's garbage. And all of a sudden, John, everything's coming up Trump.
Yeah, this is really an art of the deal kind of process where he attacks and the people he's attacking say, what do we need to do to get this over with? And then they cut a deal. And presumably the deal will be favorable to the U.S. compared to what it was before. So we'll get somewhat better terms of trade going forward. Trump will take credit for it. And that'll be that. We'll move on to some new contentious issue. More than likely. That's his style.
You have to admit total brilliance here. Can you give him that? That he knew the way it was going to work out before it worked out?
Well, he's using the strategy that he's used in his business life all along, and that has more or less worked out for him. But I'm not sure you can translate this to the geopolitical stage seamlessly, because this is a more complex situation where you're dealing with nuclear powers, you're dealing with people who do have stuff we need, and you're dealing with creditors. These guys have lent us, in effect, a ton of money. So if you antagonize them, you do that at your peril, because it's not like they're the homeowners association of a condo you're trying to buy or something like that. These guys have weapons, and it's not clear how this plays out.
Hey, I agree, but so far, so good, right? I mean, it's amazing to think that he could pull it off. What the whole world was saying was suicidal, trade war, send us Smoot-Hawley, and, the 30s and worldwide global depression, blah, blah, blah. And yet he knew something that everybody else didn't.
Well, he's working with a record high stock market right now, and a fast growing economy that he partially inherited. So if the stock market rolls over, that changes everything. And I think that's the big risk, that the financial markets don't cooperate. As long as we've got stable to rising markets, you have a lot of leeway. But we're seeing some structural issues in the stock market that are very scary, because the last year's gains are mostly due to like 5 stocks, the FANG stocks, Amazon true. And Google and Facebook and Netflix, and they're starting to roll over. Netflix has gotten really whacked lately. Facebook just got crushed. They had the biggest drop of any stock ever in terms of lost market value last week. And Facebook is down again today.
You have to enjoy
and it's
that.
Pulling down the other FANG stocks. So let them drop, and our stock market suddenly doesn't look like this unassailable castle of big, powerful tech stocks anymore. All of a sudden we're vulnerable, and that will change the process of the art of the deal in geopolitics.
Yeah, well, enjoy it while it's happening, because we don't know how much longer.